Welcome, everybody, to today's discussion of James Corbett's Century of Enslavement, the History of the Federal Reserve. This is a 2014 documentary. And as usual, James Corbett does an excellent job research, putting together the video itself, telling a story. And then at the end, as he usually does, presenting some solutions, which I think is worthwhile. The documentary starts with an FDR quote. Government has been owned by financial elements since approximately the time of Andrew Jackson. If you're not familiar with American presidents, that's not too surprising. Keep in mind, even Americans are not that familiar with American presidents, honestly. But Andrew Jackson fought a war against the Bank of the United States at that time. There was the Second Bank of the United States. So there had been a Bank of North America, which had gone away. Then there was a First Bank of the United States. The charter was not renewed. And then the Second Bank of the United States, the time being run by Nicholas Biddle, was due for a charter renewal, but they wanted to take the fight to the president and went for an early renewal of their charter. Jackson wasn't having it, and the Second Bank of the United States, I think today, is a portrait museum in Philadelphia. In any case, the Federal Reserve Act was ostensibly created to minimize panics. That was the idea. If you just let us do this, we won't have panics anymore. The irony, of course, being the panic that ostensibly led to the Federal Reserve, the Panic of 1907, was started by J.P. Morgan. So you have a banker creates a problem, then there's a classic problem, reaction, solution synthesis, and Morgan offers to help. And this eventually leads to a secret meeting on Jekyll Island. And while this is much more familiar these days with companies like Monsanto and Pfizer and these other horrible creatures, companies that are facing regulation would rather that they write the rules for their own regulation. So these days you'll find a lot of these companies will have armies of lawyers write the legislation and then hand it to friendly legislators to get that passed so they can say, hey, look, we're embracing regulation. Good afternoon, Didymus. And so they got together on Jekyll Island to write the legislation for banking. And one of the people Corbett was interviewing noted, well, all you have to do is say reform. It might have been G. Edward Griffin. That all you have to do is say reform and the people will be for it. And the interesting thing about the Federal Reserve is that despite the fact that the name is on all of the US currency, most Americans cannot tell you how the Federal Reserve works. And there's confusion as to whether it's a government agency. I think the way that it's presented, a lot of people will say, yes, it is a government agency. Or they'll look at the name federal. But a talking point that's been used by people who are opponents of central banking for many years that Federal Express, for example, FedEx, is just as federal as the Federal Reserve. And it's a bit corny, but I understand the point that they're making, and it's a true one, which is that just putting the name federal in your name, just putting the word federal in your name doesn't make you a government agency. And that's what they're trying to do with the Federal Reserve. There are actually three controlling elements of the Federal Reserve. You have the Board of Governors, you have the Federal Open Market Committee, and then you have the regional banks. What all this disguises with the names and this idea of governance and the fact that the president appoints the president of the Fed makes it seem like this is some kind of government agency. But it's not. The entire thing is privately owned. The regional banks are privately owned. So the share, for example, of the Kansas City Fed or the St. Louis Fed are owned by banks. So banks buy shares in that regional bank. The Board of Governors are nominated from different regional banks. And the Federal Open Market Committee is filled with different appointees, mostly controlled by the private banks. So I think Corbett says it somewhere in the documentary, but the Federal Reserve is not a agency. It's a form of control. It's it's not a bank. It's a system. That's what it is. And it's a system that has far reaching consequences around the world. So some might say, well, this is just having to do with America. But the entire way that the Federal Reserve works is something that other countries have then modeled and done their own way. Part of how the Federal Reserve works is something called fractional reserve banking. So if you're unfamiliar with this, the documentary explains it to you. But it's the idea of the bank issuing more money than it actually holds in reality. And you go back to the classic example. I have, let's say, 10 pieces of gold, and I come to you, you're the bank, and you take my 10 pieces of gold and you give me a receipt that says, here's 10 pieces of gold. I might charge you some kind of storage fees, and you can settle up with me for that later. But that's the idea. Okay. Now, what would happen when the banks started to realize, well, no one's tracking these pieces of paper. So when I hand back someone and say, here, you've got 10 gold pieces, and then someone could take that piece of paper and then use that to get other goods and services. The financial institutions started to realize, well, we could just do this. Uh, we could take advantage of this system. For example, other organizations, if I can call them that, would coin clip. And if you don't know what coin clipping is, go look it up. It's slightly tangential to what we're talking about today, but coin clipping and Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking live in the same universe of immorality. Now, I can't argue that fractional reserve banking in and of itself is immoral. It seems to me reasonable that you could take some amount of money just to give yourself a little bit of a breathing room as the bank so that you have some extra funds. But the idea of having 10%, so if you have 10 coins, you could loan out 90 coins against the 10 coins is crazy. And that's where we are. Fractional reserve banking presents a moral hazard. Coin clipping is immoral. Part of this is that the relationship of the Federal Reserve to the government means that these private banks can privatize profit, but they can socialize losses. And where we saw this most blatantly was during the 2008 financial crisis. If you want the definitive book, in my opinion, on this would be Aaron Ross Sorkin's Too Big to Fail. It's a 900 something page book, but it once you've read it, you will understand how everything went down the way that it did and who was responsible. And then you see after this bailout of the bankers with our own money, then we're saddled with the debt for it. And that's the logic of the Federal Reserve. They print money out of thin air. They then loan it to the government at interest as if they're adding some kind of value. They're just basically serving as a printing press. If you remove the bankers out of this and the government printed the money, this would be an entirely different situation. But what ends up happening is these private banks, they print the money and then they indebt the government. But that's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Didymus, may we take a moment to acknowledge the pioneering work of Ezra Pound, Eustace Mullins, who wrote the first major book on this. G. Edward Griffin mostly plagiarized Mullins, but refused to cite him. Huh. What, Didymus, do you know why he refused to cite him? That's disappointing to hear about G. Edward Griffin. It exists to get financial regulation into the oligarchy rather than the bureaucracy. Yeah, that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the Federal Reserve. And the idea was this is going to create price stability. But if you look at the chart in the documentary, you don't get price stability. In fact, after you can see a straight line from when the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, and you see almost a hockey stick line of higher prices. Prices are 30 times higher than when the Fed was created. Did I miss? Mullins was quasi-fascist and anti some people. Okay. Well, it's shameful to not cite somebody that you're sourcing, no matter what that person thinks. So that's too bad. So the alternatives that Corbett closes with, and I think I'll wrap up my words with this, are really wonderful. He points out that you can do things within your own local community, whether that be barter, local currency, crypto. And I think at the time, 2014, when he's putting together this documentary, there was not really a consciousness about crypto at the time. So it was cutting edge. As far as barter goes, I think unbelievably, according to the US tax code, you still have to declare the value of barter. And I've always shared this story famously. I got LASIK surgery through barter. I was a tutor at the time. I helped students with the specific exam that you had to take in America to for undergraduate placement. And I called an eye surgeon in town who I knew had 3 high school age kids, and I said, "I'd be happy to trade out my tutoring of your kids on this test if you'll trade out LASIK surgery for me." And he responded to my voicemail and he said yes. And the credit was such that about halfway through the second child, he had to start paying me. So I often say, I got paid to get LASIK. But there's a classic example of we were able to trade each other's goods and services outside of the financial system, even though the U.S. tax system would still want us to take that ingenuity and willingness to work with each other and get taxed on it. I get that to an extent, but there it is. Now you have barter, and anyone can do that. Apart from that, the local currencies, which Corbett specifically focused on something called Ithaca hours, really exemplifies what a friend of mine who knows a lot more about money than I do talks about when he says, really currency, or if you look at a unit of currency, that just represents human energy in some kind of form, whether that is paper, whether it's seashells, whatever it might be, whatever you decide to use as money, that is representing something. And what the Ithaca hours system did was simply reward hours for what people were doing in the network, whether that was, I don't know, making shoes, sewing, raising chickens, creating milk, cheese, whatever it might be. And they created these notes and they were circulating. And he said millions of dollars have gone through the system, loans. So that requires a pretty enlightened populace and a group of people who are able to make things. And one of the challenges we have in America is we have a rising generation who doesn't know how to make anything. And so it's harder to launch a local currency like that, but it's not impossible. And Corbett, I think he has a tendency to lead with hope, which I admire about him. And then finally, he talks about crypto, which we've seen all sorts of challenges in the crypto space. But the idea of smart contracts and other mechanisms that disintermediate other parties, allowing parties to connect directly with each other and save on fees, I think there's a lot of value there. But crypto conversation, maybe probably for another stream. So that's Century of Enslavement. It's about 90 minutes. I think it's well worth a watch. If for no other reason, then you might finally understand what is the Federal Reserve. It doesn't mean that you might understand what keeps it in existence. There's other forces there. But A Century of Enslavement, I think, is a very appropriate subtitle to the documentary. Did Trump ever run on an audit the Fed platform? No, I think he might have alluded to Ron Paul at some point. I don't listen. I'm the wrong person to ask. I don't pay much attention to the president either when he's in office or when he's running. Thankfully, he won't be running anymore. We can, stop hearing about him all the time. But Rand Paul endorsed him after the fact. I think in the flush of all of the great nominations that were being put forward in the first 100 days, he says, I belatedly endorsed President Trump, but I don't think that's looked so good since that time. Any other questions, thoughts, follow-ups in the chat about A Century of Enslavement? I think that it's important to know what's going on in terms of the financial system, even if we're not able to do something about it to change it, because we can then invest in alternatives for ourselves, whether that be local currencies, whether that be encouraging barter, finding ways to connect with your neighbors. God forbid you know who your neighbors are, and looking at ways to build up a defense against the next panic, the next 2008. And there are many signs that this is happening, not just in Europe, but in America and in other places, that a lot of economic indicators are pointing towards something bad on the horizon. In about 15 minutes, I'll be talking about another, I wouldn't say controversial topic, but open secret topic, the Lobby USA, which is an Al Jazeera documentary that was originally suppressed by the Qataris. So it was a 2018 documentary. I'll be talking about that over on Palestine Bookshelf in about 15 minutes. So shameless plug, if you'd like to hear about this undercover investigation done by Al Jazeera, which was very well done, I'll be talking about that over on Palestine Bookshelf. And to wrap up today, as a reminder, take a moment to watch this documentary. Even, I suppose, Didymus, I would ask you, do you recommend Creature from Jekyll Island? I have a copy of that book, and I'm thinking I will probably do a review of it sometime. But if you want to add in the chat um, the source work that you alluded to, Eustace Mullins and Ezra Pound, if you want to link to some of that source material, I think people might be interested in following up and reading that. And for those who watch the stream later after the replay, please feel free to continue the conversation in the comments. Tell it, share resources that are worth investigating and learning more about, and that way we can all continue to learn more together. I recommend Creature, but the Mullins book on the reserve even more. Okay, well, I'll have to check that out, Didymus, and hopefully that recommendation is for everyone else who's watching as well. Thanks for stopping by, and as I said, if you want to join me, I'll be over on Palestine Bookshelf in just a little bit.